So we're going to get started here at 9:03, pretty much on the dot, well, Pacific. Here's the agenda.
Have you heard of the Tigris effort? They want to do delegation. Somebody told me about it. It's another group that's trying to do delegation, but apparently they've never heard of capabilities. So I posted some comments. They responded. I named, I gave UCAN as potential reference, and I'll see about how that follows. I haven't had it. I've been busy with something else.
Amazing. Yeah. Always happy to chat with folks. If you want to pass on even my contact info.
I don't have your contact info.
Oh, okay. I'll send you my contact info. Sorry, I thought that we had been on a call or so. And anyway, send Ellen contact info after a call. All right. Yeah, like, even if they don't end up adopting the way we've done things, happy to share what we've learned. I paying it forward, you're sharing a lot of what you've learned with us too. So, but yeah, so the agenda today is in the chat. Of course, we can ad hoc it if we get through all of this stuff. Otherwise, please just drop comments in there, and we'll make sure to get to as much of it as we can. So it is 9:03. So I'm going to get started. More people may join, but it's recorded. So if people miss anything, they can always watch the recording. So just a couple updates off the top. I've been, I was upgrading all the specs to 1.0 and breaking them apart and, doing some of this maintenance that we've talked about doing for a while, and then got sidetracked with Fission's fundraise a little bit. So hoping to get back to that. I was hoping to have it done this week before this call, but I couldn't quite make it. So updates on the spec side of things. We updated Awake, which is the essentially mutual handshake using UCAN to use MLS. Know that has been rubber stamped. And so we have I was actually just talking to one of our engineers who's looking at doing the implementation with OpenMLS, which is really great because then that gets us not just handshakes, but then also secure multi-party communication bootstrapped up with UCAN. In fact, MLS looks like it has a section in it for essentially presenting a credential and to prove that you're allowed into the group. So using that, updated the bearer token spec. Quinn on the Fission team has been digging into our specs. She has a long history in security, used to work at a security company, did CTF, all that stuff. And so has been poking around with like, hey, could I break it this way? Could I break it that way? I'm like, yeah, probably. Okay, cool, let's fix that. So updated the bearer token spec to make it, we had a table before of CIDs to UCANs, and we've removed the CID portion. You're going to have to hash them yourself, but it prevents a cache poisoning attack, which, security is pretty important, and we can handle that in tooling so that people don't have to do this manually themselves. MLS, yeah, MLS is messaging layer security. So,
yeah, okay. Somebody put a link in.
Yeah.
And where is the bearer token spec? Can you put a link to that?
Yeah, sure. So it's an absolute hack, but there was a bunch of teams that were already putting that's Awake, bearer, UCAN as bearer token, that were putting UCANs in the authorization header. On as an authorization bearer, even though it's not that, but it plugs into all of the existing tooling. And so this is essentially how to transfer them a standard way so that we can build tooling around it to transfer them around using this horrible hack. It's still not a bearer token. But
yeah, that's why I was curious. The string is signed. Yeah, 25 years ago or so, Tyler Close put X509 certificates in the fragment of a URL. Same kind of idea.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's to have this spec is to say, like, here's how to do this properly, even though you're using this named field, or the field that's named like incorrectly, but like this is what everybody's doing. So even somebody on this call right now is like, yeah, that's what we're doing too, right? So and then we'll be able to provide packages as well. And I know like the subconscious team who've adopted UCAN are using this, and it's just plugged into all of their web server software just automatically for them, and does all the parsing and all of this stuff, and then they pass it on to the UCAN implementation to inspect further. So that's actually been a nice way of working, even though you have to realize it's not actually a bearer token.
Yeah, okay. It could
Yeah.
actually go in the fragment without the security problems of putting tokens in fragments because they're signed.
Oh, interesting. Right. Good to know. Okay. I might pick your brain about that later as well. Yeah, and then a few people have asked, including some of the folks that we've had implementing it, like, why are we switching to MLS for Awake? So we used to do double ratchet signals version of this, but we had to do our own implementation, which we weren't thrilled about. Never roll your own. We weren't rolling the crypto portions of this, right? But like we want to do as little of the protocol as possible. And MLS is almost certainly going to become, and in fact is already in production in a bunch of places, the standard for this. There's been a lot of work in thinking about like the group management and how do you make it fast, and the tooling and all of this stuff. So just jumping on that bandwagon seems like a good way to approach that, and then also makes Awake very useful in a lot of cases. So you could, one of the cases that we have for it is we want to set up a raft consensus so that only one person has to make invocations instead of this entire group when they're working on a collaborative document. But you could also imagine, being allowed into a group chat based on, things like this, right? So it makes it very general. Plus, we get all the additional security of having many eyes on the implementation of much more of the stack. So when we sort of sketched it out, about 90% of what we were doing before is now handled by the OpenMLS.
So just want to point out, I don't know if OpenMLS covers this. One of the mistakes Google made in their group system, I've forgotten what it was called, they shut it down now, was that you could invite someone into the group, but they didn't track who invited the person into the group. Which, if somebody was abusive, you also wanted to blame the inviter, not just the abusive party. And I don't know if MLS does that, but it's a very important feature.
Yeah, I don't think it has that tracking with it. It does have forward security. So if somebody gets kicked out, and even if they break back in, they're routinely cleared. But
the problem was the person who continually invites abusive participants.
Right.
Not abusive herself, but and so you need that tracking.
I'll just take that as a note. MLS, basically provenance, invite provenance tracking. Okay. Breakpoints, and definitely worth digging into. I'll have to double check if they have something like that, but I don't remember seeing that in the spec.
Groove did, as I recall, but the Google one did not. Google Circles, I think it was.
Yeah. Could you use the UCAN to track this? It depends on how it's done. So MLS itself, you either need an invite from somebody else using a shared secret, or you present, at least in OpenMLS, an X509 certificate, to which we're saying, instead of X509, let's use a UCAN. Right? If you show up with that certificate, it's not that you've been invited, it's that you're showing, hey, I have this, and the group could record that UCAN and have the delegation chain in it. And then if somebody gets revoked, you then check those and kick out whoever needs to be kicked out. That's a good point, and that's probably worth putting into the system. Okay. This call is being useful. This is great. Really quickly, the other specs. So the main UCAN spec, UCAN working group /spec, had a bunch of stuff in there. talks about revocation, talks about this, special URI scheme, there's a bunch of things. And even though, like revocation took up a sizable portion of the spec, people's eyes just slid over it. Like nobody saw that section, right? Got a lot of questions about revocation. So I had posted a couple of weeks ago, maybe 2 months ago at this point, like, hey, here's a rough breakdown of how we're thinking about this. We're going to have a high level spec that talks about how the system fits together in general, and then a delegation, invocation, and revocation specs, and then UCAN URI as well, that are, then have the space to really go into what's the motivation for revocation? Why did we design it this way? Like, all of this extra information as well. And when people want to see how do I do revocation, they don't have to know to go into this other spec and like go down to this section. It's like UCAN working group / revocation. So I'm in the middle of doing that right now. Revocation is, I believe, ready to be looked at. If anyone wants to look at that spec, that'd be
when
great.
did you push it? Because when you sent out the announcement, I looked and revocation was pretty much empty.
I think it's in a PR right now. Let me get you the link.
The invocation spec was fleshed out, but
yeah, and the invocation spec is going to get some updates as well. Okay, so that's the revocation PR. There's a link right at the top of the post that says preview. So if you click into that, you'll be taken to the rendered markdown. Invocation spec was originally written to support work in IPVM, which is a separate community, but Daghouse and Fission were and Bacaliao were all working on this system together that were all supported with UCAN underneath, and they needed an invocation spec, but they're all in the IPFS ecosystem, so we were using IPFS tools. And there's been requests since for like, hey, we're using JWT for UCAN. Can we have a JWT version? Or like, I want to use this with an RPC. Could I have an RPC version? And unlike UCAN delegation, where these are going to live and move around the system and need to be quite interoperable, this invocation is just point to point. So only these two need to agree on what the invocation looks like. So we're breaking out the IPLD version as invocation IPLD. There'll be a high-level invocation spec, and then if you want to have a JWT version or some kind of other RPC version, we can do those as specs as well. Something that Oracle had asked for a long time with UCAN delegation was, can we make it format agnostic? And the answer for that one has been no, because we need it to be interoperable, right? At least the signature, because that locks in the exact encoding. But invocation is a different case. So, and then delegation, it's going to get its own repo. So I've created the repository for it. It's mainly deleting stuff that has now been split out. Also not merged. There's a work in progress PR for that as well. And as we're doing a Rust implementation, or RSUCAN already exists, we're putting a bunch of effort into it as part of this 1.0 push, because then we get a version that runs everywhere, runs natively and can compile down to WebAssembly. So we could also put it in the browser, wrap it, with JS tooling, et cetera. It's not to say that we're getting rid of TSUCAN, but this is another way of doing this as a well-supported version. And also we've had requests for a Go implementation. Given that we don't have the resources for that right now, the people we've talked to who want that are like, oh, we could use a WebAssembly version. So this seems like a good direction. Some of the feedback from working in that as well is like, oh, why is the nonce optional? It's like, yeah, it shouldn't be optional. If somebody really wants to make it optional, they can make it a blank string, right? Things like this. So there's a little bit of cleanup happening in there going into the 1.0. And as soon as we hit that 1.0 and it's, the community signs off on it and it gets merged, like that's the data format for the next while, unless there's some horrible security bug, basically, in there. So we're going to want a lot of eyes on this before we do that merge. And we can always add stuff later, but it's very hard to remove stuff, right? So feeling about how Semper works, basically. So I was hoping to have a lot of that stuff done for today, but you know, time being what it is. Yeah, so I'd say the delegation spec is about 85% of the way there, but it definitely needs a bunch more work. And the invocation and invocation IPLD specs are about half done, half being split apart and updated. There was a really old PR in there that we hadn't merged, but we were actually using. So it's getting a bit of a facelift, basically. So on the spec side, that's most of the updates. Before a bunch of other people showed up, I had mentioned Ellen has a bunch of comments and questions in, I think, both the Discord and has filed issues for them, I believe, that we just haven't gotten around to yet, but is definitely at least on Fission's backlog to look at. So Ellen, thanks as always for the giving this stuff thought and taking a look at it. I also saw UCAN came up a little bit in the Google group, the capabilities Google group as well. And so I've been meaning to get back there too. Brian, do you want to talk a little bit about the work you've been doing?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have, so this is more on the implementation side and getting together a good set of conformance tests. This is still sort of in draft form because, as Brooke mentioned, there are a couple of spec tweaks, and Quinn is working on the RSUCAN implementation. But I have sort of an initial set of test fixtures. This is just for the delegation spec that I just put into the chat. And so these are generated by RSUCAN, and our first effort will be to, look through them manually, make sure they are actually conformant, and then go back to RSUCAN once the updates are in place and make sure everything checks out there. And then that will give folks like a nice set of test fixtures so that if they want to do a Go UCAN, I know, Charles, you've got an implementation, so you'll be able to consume those as well. I was telling Brooke this morning, one thought I had for these fixtures is that for each fixture, we can also add a field that's like, which specification is it and which section of the specification? So it could kind of serve as sort of like a map. If you're going through and implementing, you can say, oh, this fixture, I need to go to this spec at this part and read the spec and see how I'm going to implement this. Once we have those conformance tests in place, well, I think that's the major thing that I've been working on the implementation side. So yeah.
Awesome.
Oh, sorry. JS packaging. Thank you. Brooke mentioned, we want to get this down to like WASM and get it running in the browser. There are a bunch of sort of like bundling the stuff and bundling WebAssembly for the browser and for every framework and for SvelteKit and everything is quite challenging. But Ugo has been, who's on the call, has been doing a bunch of work figuring out how we can get this working for Node and for SvelteKit and for Next.js and React apps. We have, Ugo, do you want to put in a link to our repo for WASM.js? That might be like generally helpful to folks, but we're going to use stuff from that in RSUCAN to make it so that folks will be able to use it in any sort of JavaScript environment. Well, hopefully any. There's so many. Okay, now that's all.
Okay. And we had in the agenda Quinn to give an update on the RSUCAN stuff. I was looking at it just the other day with her, so I think I can give a reasonable update. So we've been moving our entire stack at Fission to Rust, and got to the point where we wanted to integrate RSUCAN. definitely works. The team that was working on that had some suggestions on how the API could be made smoother. And so Quinn was just coming off of some other work. And so it was a good opportunity for her to jump in and just dedicate some resources to this thing that has been mainly one team doing off the side of their desk while trying to ship another product, right? And so mainly tuning it for I think partly for their use case, but also like it's not their full-time gig, right? So definitely usable, totally worked, was super awesome. But we essentially had some feature requests that were like, if we're going to take this thing to a 1.0, we should also be contributing to this as well. So Quinn's full-time thing right now is working on UCAN, which is nice. And some of the APIs that she's been working on are at least we think relatively ergonomic. So I think that'll be a nice upgrade there as well that then everybody can use. And that is the end of the major agenda items. Does anybody else have stuff that they'd like to chat about? Charles, I think you had mentioned something or looked excited when I was like, other people can talk about things too earlier, but don't want to put you too much on the spot.
There's probably a few things. I'm very excited about the MLS integration. MLS is something I looked at in the past before UCAN's, but combined they would be an amazing combination. Also, the WASM.js packaging is actually also something we've been looking at as Spruce because we also have the same strategy. Maybe we can circulate our learnings back to you guys as well on that. We have a different engineer working on that, not me. But also one thing that's I haven't looked at the updated repos with the new spec format. But one thing that I noticed in separate calls was inconsistent was are we restricting header entries or not? Basically.
The JWT header. Yeah, we are.
Okay, cool, great, fantastic.
And part of the reasoning for that, I mean, if we lived in a world where people were only doing JWT things and they were willing to sign over that, then that would be much more open. There's a lot of interest in essentially parsing that information out and passing it around in a standardized format for people that aren't using JWT. And so knowing which fields to actually parse out is pretty important. If there was a strong use case for having other headers, then great. But we've in fact even taken there used to be a UCAN version in the header, and we've since moved that into the body, for example, which kind of makes sense, right? It's not about the JWT, it's about the stuff inside of it. And it made it easier to interoperate with existing libraries, which often have a fixed set of header fields. And that's one of the design goals, is to make this as easy as possible to use off-the-shelf tooling to implement.
Yeah, I agree entirely. And I think the thing I was really excited about was the test vector generation from Brian, which I'm very excited to get into. Fantastic, thanks.
Awesome. Was there anything else people want to chat about? I realize that this so far has been mostly information delivery. We don't have to use the whole hour if we don't want to, but if there's stuff people want to dig into, we do have the other half hour.
I don't want to delay and keep everybody from real work, but I don't think that you can have a 1.0 with the invocation spec as it is, because there's no way to pass parameters of return resources, permission to resources as a return value. And you have to be both. So let's say I ask you to compare two documents and give me a document about permission to read a document that has the diffs. How would I express that with the current invocation spec?
You'd get that back as part of the receipts as a UCAN.
Well, I mean, I read the spec and I don't see where that is. I don't see where to provide permission to read another document. So I can I invoke and I specify which document I want you to read, right? Or write or do whatever. But how do I designate a second document to compare it with that may not be controlled by the same resource server and may need a UCAN in order to get permission to access it?
So you're not saying as part of the output getting access to another document.
I'm saying
You're saying
both. You need both. You need both. How do I
Right.
specify a second argument that may have a different resource provider? So you need the invoked provider will need a UCAN in order to access that second one. I didn't see that in the spec. And then how would that resource provider return permission to get the result document, let's say?
Yeah, so invocations form a graph. So you essentially provide a list. It does the resolution based on content address, so based on hash. And so you'd have one invocation for read this document, you have another one for read that document, and you take the outputs and put them into a third that says compare the two outputs is how you do that part.
But I am sending my request to one server, and it owns the first document. That's the invocation.
Yep.
And it needs to be able to get another document from some other service. How do I pass that permission to it?
Yeah, so the invocation portion is just talks about, I want you to do this thing. The delegation to go fetch something from that other resource is still just a regular delegation you can. So I would delegate to them, here's a handle basically to that other resource. And what I want you to do with that is pull down the text.
And all I said was, I just don't see how to do that in the current, as I was reading the spec. You know, two separate messages. Just, you know, that's a use case that you need to demonstrate you can do. That was
right. Yeah. Okay. Unclear how to pull from or how to maybe access separate resources and return more UCANs in the invocation spec. Okay. Yeah, that's really good feedback. So this is a thing I had mentioned before. We had done a lot of the initial spec work for this as part of this project called IPVM. And the use case that you're talking about is essentially its bread and butter. And so if that's not clear from the spec, then we definitely need to fix that.
Yeah. And you know, you have a very simple example with a single resource, but I think the example could cover this. You don't need another one, just one example that has those two additional pieces.
Yeah, totally. Maybe worth picking your brain on a little bit here. So the approach that we've taken right now is to have essentially individual messages to say, like, here's individual steps, and then we can schedule those, you know, inside of a workflow, sort of like as needed. If I ask one machine, hey, do all of this stuff for me, but it only knows how to do one part of it, but it can coordinate with another, right? Like they can split that work up and bring results together, and kind of, it gives us that flexibility. The other approach is to allow infinite nesting of invocation and essentially let people write in AST of invocations. We decided not to do that initially because that sounds both more complex for the end user, and you're giving the user a bunch of guarantees, or you're letting them specify an order in which they think things will happen, which may not be how it is actually executed. In sort of, you know, classic object capabilities, I think this is less of an issue because you're just handing around references and making RPC calls, basically. And so it's assumed that the message you send will include, you know, an understanding of how it's going to get run. You're not passing around AST, I think. do you have any thoughts on that? Has anybody tried doing this second version before, or is sending essentially like a batch of messages to say like, hey, I want you to do all of these things, figure out how you want to get them done? Is that usually how it's been done in the past?
Usually it's the API of the service you're invoking specifies the arguments, what they mean, and how they're processed.
Mhm.
And by the way, if you're going to do the AST approach, you're not going to rely on the programmer. The tooling is going to have to do it.
Yep.
Programmers will not understand that at all. So, but it's an interesting approach. I haven't seen it. Every capability system I've worked on, the API determines what the arguments are, and that's what I was looking for in this spec.
Mhm.
The fact that you can, in a single message, send a set of tasks is a way in which you could do the multiple steps in a single message. One of the other things I noted, though, was I think the permission set is outside of the list of tasks, and I think the permissions need to be per task. So I think that's
Okay.
Otherwise, you can't say, oh, I want this permission for that task and this other permission for this other task on the same resource. You have no way to say that. And I think I put that in the comment in there on that.
Mm-hmm. And is that more to because whoever you're sending this to gets access to all those delegations, right? Like let's say that they're a malicious actor, they would be able to take them and do other things with them.
Which is why exactly why you don't want the wildcard capabilities there. You want the least privilege.
For sure. Absolutely. And actually maybe that's even worth forcing in the spec, but where's my permission? Oh, right, permissions per task. Having them broken out per task that way, is it just that it gives clarity about here's the capability you'll need to actually invoke this, as opposed to putting them all in one list? Okay.
Yes.
So it's more of a clarity component.
Yeah, because you might end up with a kind of a confused deputy if you pooled all the permissions and then plucked out whichever one happened to match.
Mm-hmm.
It's not actually a confused deputy, but it's the kind of confusion that you can get. Mm-hmm. And once it has the permission, you might get another request to use that permission, and then you would get a real confused deputy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The way we've been treating it is that you have to have all of the, like, it's not that you then store all of these and you can reuse them for requests, is that they have to be explicitly referenced per request. But yeah, breaking them down further is something we had talked about doing in the past, but it was sort of like, well, but what are we really gaining? I think I'll have to think on the exact threat model a little bit more, maybe.
It may not be a threat model as much as a foot gun. That it's too easy to mix up the permissions if they're just a big pool for all the tasks. The normal OCAP approach is to designate the resource with the capability. In other words, the UCAN is the on. Right?
Yeah.
You just put the UCAN, then there's no issue. You don't need a separate field for permissions and all that. You just put the UCAN, and it's obvious that you have to delegate if it's not the endpoint and all that. And everything conceptually gets simpler. And by using one URI to designate in a separate field for the permission, you've complicated things, and I think unnecessarily.
Yeah, that's interesting. Just literally using the UCAN itself, and then having the invocation be arguments in addition to that for this specific.
And then the arguments are delegation UCANs.
Yeah. if we have a promise pipeline, sometimes I need permissions because I'm not going to be returned as the requester at every step, right? The point is that it'll run a bunch of things. I need to give the executor permissions to do like no wider than, but permissions to do whatever possible thing would come back from its successive requests on the pipeline. How would you handle that in that case? Because I now need to give them permissions that are basically big enough to handle, strong enough to handle this workflow.
I've never seen promise pipelining in a certificate-based capability system, but I would model it on E. E does promise pipelining, and it handles it just perfectly with object references. You just replace each object reference with a UCAN, and you're done. Right. So whatever you would do in an OCAP distributed program, that's your model. So every object reference in the program becomes a UCAN. End of story.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting approach. Feels pretty clean. And yeah, like we've been modeling a lot of stuff on E, but not this particular part, obviously. So yeah, definitely a good time to take a look at this stuff.
And you know about the sprightly work?
Yeah. Oh yeah, I know the team fairly well.
They have promise pipelining too.
Yeah.
And it's using CapTP underneath it, so it's E-like, but it might be since E is not a familiar language, they're using a scheme-like language, using Racket, and so that might be easier to model.
Yeah, we were involved early on in the OCAPN discussions, and then the scheduling got difficult. So they've now made it, I think, every first Tuesday of the month, and so we're going to get involved in that again as well. So we should, in theory, we should be interoperable once we catch up on all that work.
But I learned this from Mark Miller a long time ago, that if you want to understand the permission structure of some complicated distributed system, think of it in terms of object capabilities as a single program. And then you can understand where the certificates go and what they should say.
Yeah, makes sense.
Eric, that was my rant.
Charles?
Just if that topic's finished and there's no other topics. I wanted to bring up WebAuthn again. Last time me and Hugo met, we discussed whether it would be okay to allow, basically in the ALG field in the header, saying Varsig, and then just the signature is a Varsig. And then from there, we can just open the trapdoor and whatever comes. Is that deviating too far from the design goal of all UCANs are valid JWTs? Or yeah, I just wanted to get your opinion basically before doing anything.
Is that a question for me or for Ugo?
I think it's for you.
Okay. So using Varsig for that. So for UCAN IPLD, I think Varsig's totally fine. Using non-standard signature types, I think is a totally fine thing for those use cases. Like you have to understand how that signature works. It's not going to be broadly interoperable, right? It won't work with everyone. But EDDSA also wasn't. In fact, I'm not even sure if it's in any JWT spec yet. It was like added much later, right? So it's a thing that we had talked about doing a long time ago, basically capturing all this extra information as part of the signature, right? I think, you know, as we talked a few weeks ago, using the PRF extension makes this really simple, right? Obviously, you don't get the non-extractable keys portion, but then you don't have to. There's no extra magic anymore, right? Like it's just normal crypto. Using a non-standard signature type, or inventing a signature type for it. Again, it's how we initially thought this would have to work. We never got around to implementing it, and then we saw the PRF stuff, and we're like, oh, okay, cool, this solves our problem for us. I'm certainly not against it as a concept, just again with the asterisks, not everyone will be able to read that UCAN.
That makes sense. Yep. Cool. Thanks.
Yep.
Just add one more thing that came up with in the chat with ceramic folks. And I didn't realize this because I was like focusing on the PRF. If you don't use like the PRF or any other means of like doing another key pair instead of the authenticator key pair, so there's two methods on WebAuthn, like register and get, or whatever it's called. You can't access the public key. You can only access the public key on register. So you need to figure out the public key afterwards in some other way. There's no way to get the public key on the subsequent get to WebAuthn, which is a bummer.
Yeah, our approach so far has been that, so our focus is on using an iframe that developers will have to embed into their page, that keeps the same, so then you have the same authenticator on every domain. So if you are making direct signatures, you have the same DID, blah, blah, blah. And that iframe will communicate with a backend server that we have that records the registration event and keeps the credential record and updates it whenever signature is made, which is not ideal, but it is part of the WebAuthn spec. So yeah, that's how we're kind of doing that. Varsig, because we embed everything into the Varsig, I have not yet, but in that little proposal I made on the Varsig thing, I'm going to include the public key. Well, actually, no, I misspeak. It's a DID key, so the public key is already present in the issuer field. But yeah, we can be, because it's Kakaoland is like super flexible. If up till now, till what I mentioned, we're on the Kakao route. If we can say alg varsig, then I'd be happy to actually just make it a UCAN. That'll remove a lot of indirection. Yeah.
Yeah, I think alg varsig would like that specific text would work. You'll have some overlap with other, like if somebody then uses a regular RSA signature, right? Like people probably shouldn't do that, but there's nothing preventing them from doing it, right? So sure. Might be worth noting where that's implemented, that if they're using something that's already in another spec or in another standard tooling, that they should probably just use the standard tooling where possible.
Yeah, I do agree. I want to keep it as open as possible. For the next probably 6 months, our tooling is probably just going to be issuing delegations for things that'll, like, the consumers of these things will also be things that we have produced. But I don't want to lock out, in future, if someone wants to issue a delegation that, represents 5 different services and one of them is ours, I don't want the other services to be unable to verify that signature and so on. Yeah. I'll keep it in mind. I'll try and figure out a thing for this. I wish PRF was more widely supported. It is. I'm sure it'll become more widely adopted though, because YubiKey already supports it. So hardware, as far as hardware goes, that's fine. Mostly it's on the software side, which is easy updates. So
yeah, it still does have the extractable problem, right? The PRF stuff, because now you have bytes in memory unprotected. But it does make life much easier, right? on these things.
yeah,
No.
we're hoping that by using an iframe, we kind of get around that via the browser's sandboxing. Hopefully that's good enough.
Yeah, that's the lobby thing that I talked with you, Brooklyn. It's basically the same thing. Just having one that holds the thing for everyone instead of like making every app their own lobby. Then you can do things like this and like keep a little bit of state and whatnot.
I've been pitching it to not all, but some of my coworkers as an analogous to a MetaMask wallet, basically. Like it's a little extra thing that just has its own keys.
Exactly. That's exactly how I talk about it too. Yeah. Nice to have the same idea. It kind of validates. And hopefully next week I'll have a little bit more time to go back to passkeys and kind of update the matrix I have there, because I think there's a bunch of new stuff that's already supported, especially on the new Apple stuff, like Sonoma and iOS 17, which I think pretty soon will be stable. So I think we're going to have a little bit of good news. I already am on Sonoma, just didn't have time to fully test it out and update the matrix.
That's very good to hear. Yeah. Oh, one thing you might be interested in if you don't already know, but you might. Through an iframe, public key credentials create is not supported on any platform I know about. It doesn't seem like it's possible at all to register an authenticator in an iframe, regardless of the context or what headers you put or anything. This seems to be a known issue in the WebAuthn ecosystem. Yeah. Chrome says they support it, but no one can make it work.
Interesting. Good to know. Thank you.
So this is a Quaker-like meeting. We sit around until somebody has something to pipe up. But if nobody has anything else, I have one last thing. I was hoping Irakli would be here. A couple of weeks ago, I saw a really terrible movie, and the bad guys were the Iraklians. So
No. We'll have to pass that on to him.
yeah. And somebody I put in the chat that Brooklyn, advanced AI named Brooklyn. I can't find it now again, but if you did get it, forward it to Brooklyn, please.
I found it, but it looks like it's paywalled now.
Yeah.
But I did actually share it in Brooklyn's monologue like back a month ago. So and you can see it in the preview still. The preview is not paywalled.
Okay. Awesome. Probably while I was on vacation. So yeah. I'll dig back through and see if I can find it.
It belongs in the spec somewhere.
Yeah. Yeah. Amazing. Well, we have 9 minutes left in the time slot. If there's any last things people want to chat about.
I'll pipe in. Hi everyone. I'm Zachary. I don't know if I've made too much words yet for you all, but I'm really excited to be a part of these kind of conversations. I want to share a nice little history book here that I have from 1984. So we have a long tradition to uphold here, and I love singing the song of capability-based systems to everyone and anyone, and to some good effect, I believe. So I just want to introduce that I'm in a position where I'm looking to build a team, and very passionate about and raising funds and doing the whole startup woohoo thing, and really looking forward to baking in key signing, and essentially doing something like an identity feature within what's sort of shaping up as an extension currently, to do sort of bottom-up moderation using currently the technique is using LLMs to like parse negative comments, but the goal on the long term is to do provenance of information sources, and the only way I can ever see of doing that is signing things. So really looking forward to building a team, and perhaps being more and more involved in your all efforts here with this. Seems like a very promising avenue, and so
Yeah,
yes,
if you're a capabilities guy, I know people who might be interested and might be available to work. So I put my email in the chat.
Oh, great, Alan. So Alan, we met actually back in 2016, I believe. I was working on like a early capability-based protocol type play that Martin was helping advise on the Economic Space Agency Gravity.
Oh yeah, no, I do remember that
with Jorge. With Jorge, I was the other person along with Jorge on that.
No, I remember that. I couldn't place the face. I looked familiar, but
yeah.
So again, and you can come talk to our Friday morning capabilities group too.
You guys are still meeting? I'm in the area, so yeah.
Well, we don't meet physically anymore, but anyway.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll drop you a line on email in any case. Okay. So yes, and also I'm interested in the details for the implementers spec as well. Might want to see about a good way to understand something is to build it, right? So, and then also a good way to test something is to have multiple implementations all converging on the same answer. So hopefully that could be a benefit to all for to build against some of that spec. So plus one on that.
Awesome, amazing. Yeah, no, sounds really positive. We've been looking, so at my company Fission, we've been looking at data provenance sort of in general, not using LLMs or anything. We have a project that's currently on pause called Rhizome, which is one way of looking at it as a database, another way of looking at it as a CRDT framework. But under the hood, it entirely depends on data provenance. So it might be interesting to get you on a call with Quinn as well to talk through some of the stuff that she's learned about that as well.
Would absolutely love that. I'm also pretty deep into Prolog space. So
nice. Okay. Yeah.
Which is data log, relational, hypergraph database type stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. So this project was all done on data log. So there will be a lot to talk about, I think. Yeah.
Would love to. Yeah, please send me information. Any time that you all have, I'll make time for it.
Awesome. If you could drop me your contact info, I'll set that up.
Yeah. And then Brooklyn, I think we're also in the same one of the same signal threads that Christine's XColon. So you can also find
Oh yeah.
Signal's actually the most best way of saying hi to me. It's the thing I
Okay.
check.
Awesome. Yeah, I think Quinn's actually also in XPollen, so that might just be an easy way
Yes.
to be like, you two should go talk.
Hmm.
Awesome. All right. Well, under 3 minutes remaining in the time slot, and I know a few of us have another call at the top of the hour. As always, thanks everyone for joining these calls. Alan, thank you so much for continuing to share with us the right way to do things, and for your insightful questions. And hopefully I'll have some more specs for everyone to review soon, in giant star quotes, and see you all next month.
Okay.
See you guys.